Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. It's good to see you made it back for another episode. Today I'm going to be sharing some creepy and allegedly true disturbing horror stories that were shared on this channel over the past couple of weeks. Some of these stories might be new to you, and some of these you may have heard before. I hope you enjoy this long compilation, and I will see you guys soon with some more creepy stories. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Before we hop right into this video though, today we are sponsored once again by IPVanish. What is IPVanish, you ask? Well, it's a VPN. A VPN is a super important tool that helps you safely browse the internet. You can use a VPN on your computers, tablets, phones, even things like your Fire Stick when you're streaming media. When you use a VPN, all of your data is encrypted. What you're reading, what you're searching, what you're watching, whatever it is you're doing. That's important because what you're doing on the internet is nobody else's business but yours. IPVanish helps you remain anonymous and secure on the internet. For listeners of the show, IPVanish is offering an incredible 65% off. That's just $349 for the first month or $3149 for the year. Here's everything you get with IPVanish. Anonymous IP addresses. This means your personal IP address can't be tracked by anyone on the web. You can circumvent any online censorship. IPVanish has more than 1,500 servers in 70 plus locations. You can get protection while using public Wi-Fi. Remember, with IPVanish, all your data is encrypted, so no one can snoop on what you're doing. You get 24/7 support. You can email them, chat with them, even call them. They're there to help. And it's great to be able to have a human being to troubleshoot with. So go to ipvanish.com/swamped and claim your 65% savings. This is the time to sign up. With our discount and their current promotional offerings, you can get a VPN for 65% off their usual offering. IPVanish is the best of the best, even rated 4.7 out of 5 stars on Trustpilot with over 6,000 reviews. Show these guys some love. They're repeat sponsors of the show and help us out a lot. Remember, it's ipvanish.com/swamped to get the deal and start protecting yourself online. I grew up in a big house that was on the corner of a quiet street, right in front of a 5-star retirement home. On the other side of the street, in between all the big, beautiful houses, was a small, old house with wood covering all the windows. If you didn't live on my street, you'd probably think nobody lived in that sketchy little house. Throughout the day, random cars would pull into the back of the house where they could be seen, and I'd see men walk in and out of the house. Sometimes men would sit on the front porch and drink and smoke. Around 9:30 p.m. each evening, the nurse or caregiver shifts would change in the retirement home. In front of my house was a bus stop where all the employees would wait for the bus or their rides. It was approximately 10 p.m. on a warm night in June. I was in my basement and I had the windows cracked open. I was at home with my mom and 3 sisters when I heard screaming from outside. My sisters heard it as well. We looked outside the windows, but it was too dark to really see anything clearly. We saw a woman running around 3 cars in our driveway, and we assumed someone was breaking into our cars. So we turned on the outside light and spotted a woman screaming, "Help me!" and running around the cars. She was being chased by 2 men. We got scared and ran inside to our mom. My sisters and I were young teens at the time and too scared to go outside by ourselves. The screaming continued for a few minutes until I saw the man grab the woman and try to push her into the trunk of their SUV. She was trying her hardest to fight back and resist. At that exact moment, my dad was arriving home and noticed a black Jeep and its trunk open, blocking the street. He flashed his lights and honked at them, not knowing what was going on at all. The kidnappers thought someone had spotted them, and they immediately threw the woman on the ground, got in a car, and drove off. My dad parked his car and found the woman on the ground. She was crying, and she kept thanking my dad. As my dad had connected the dots and realized that he had stopped her from getting thrown into a van, he looked around and saw a few men standing outside the sketchy house, and realized they were watching the whole kidnapping happen without interfering at all. He invited the woman into our house and called the police. She was a 55-year-old nurse, and she told us she waits outside of our home for her son to pick her up every single day. She was thankful for my dad. When the police took our statements and gathered the kidnappers' fingerprints from our cars, since they were running around our cars and touching them as they ran, my dad told the police he suspected the men from the sketchy house across the street. He thinks they may have been involved. After the cops left that night, a man walked over to our house and told my dad, "You made a mistake by saying something to the police." Since that day, anytime I went outside to play, they'd be staring at me, and if I walked home from school, they'd begin to walk after me. They were incredibly creepy and scary. Eventually, the cops busted their house for a bunch of illegal activity. They drilled the doors shut, and I never saw anyone ever go in that house again. I did see the 55-year-old nurse sometimes as she got off work. She now works earlier in the day. She always waves at us as she walks by. I was born and raised in Fort Collins, Colorado, home of the Colorado State University Rams. It was mid-January 2016. I was just 23 years old and had recently started dabbling in the dating scene again. I met a guy on eHarmony, and we decided to meet for breakfast at a little restaurant. The date went really well, and after about an hour and a half, my date, whom I'll call Josh, asked if I wanted to go for a walk with him and his dog, Bandit. I told him I'd love to, so we left the restaurant and I followed him in my car to an open space area called Legacy Park in North Fort Collins that ran along the Poudre River. I texted my mom to be safe and told her where we were going. Snow covered the footpath that we walked along. Josh and I talked about our favorite places to hike in Colorado. We both mentioned wanting to do a 14er that summer. Bandit was off leash, running and playing in the snow. Josh mentioned he wasn't totally comfortable having Bandit off leash because some of the frozen over sections along the river could crack and him fall in. All of a sudden, we heard a little splash in the river. We thought maybe it was a bird or a falling snow or something. But before we could do anything, Bandit immediately ran towards the river and jumped in, chasing the sound. Josh and I immediately ran to the bank and noticed that the area Bandit was in was not frozen over, but the edges around the bank were. Bandit was trying to pull himself out of the water, but couldn't. The ice along the edge was too slippery. In that moment, both of us panicked. Josh started screaming Bandit's name, and we both ran down the stream trying to get ahead of him. Only 100 or so feet away was a big frozen over area. We didn't get there in time, and Bandit went under the ice. With our adrenaline rushing, both of us jumped back on top of the ice, screaming and searching the water below for his dog. All of a sudden, we heard a loud crack, and the sound of cracking ice echoed throughout the woods. I looked at Josh in fear, and we both fell through the ice into the frozen water. The water was only waist deep, but the temperature took my breath away. Both Josh and I struggled to get back on the ice, but we were only able to pull ourselves up. Within about 60 seconds, Bandit resurfaced on the other side of the ice block. Josh grabbed him by his collar and pulled him onto the ice. We both swam and dragged him back to the embankment. Josh was screaming for help, and by that time a few joggers had stopped to help us and had actually called 911. Bandit wasn't breathing, so I immediately started CPR on him while I screamed for someone to get help. Josh was inconsolable. As I was doing CPR, I could hear the sloshing of water in Bandit's lungs, and I knew it was bad. Josh screamed, "We have to get him to a vet. Run back to your car, Hannah. Get to your car." With that, I jumped and started running back to the parking lot about a half-mile away. I was soaking wet, freezing, and didn't even realize right away that I had lost my shoes in the river. I got to my car and floored it through the woods to get to Josh and Bandit. When I found them, Josh had Bandit in his arms and was running towards me. He jumped in my car and I raced to an emergency vet about a mile away. When we got to the clinic, we threw open the door screaming for help. Several veterinary staff ran out of the back and took Bandit from Josh's arms. We both fell to the floor, sobbing. One of the vet techs stayed with us for quite a while the staff vigorously worked on Bandit. At this point, I had no idea what to do. I had just met this guy. I didn't know if he wanted me to hug him or hold him or leave him alone. After about 15 minutes, the vet came out crying and told us they did everything they could, but Bandit did not make it. The screaming and crying that came after was something from a horror movie. Josh called his family, who were from Arizona. As he spoke to them, the staff asked me if I needed anything. I told them that this was actually a first date and I had no idea what to do. One of the staff noticed an open bleeding wound on my foot and bandaged it up for me. I didn't know it at the time, but I also had 2 broken toes and had ripped off my big toenail. I know this isn't necessarily a scary story, but it was the worst date and probably the worst day I have ever had. My heart is still broken over 5 years later as I write this story. I don't even really know how to begin this story, but I will try my absolute best. So I dated this guy for almost 2 years. I will refer to him as Jake. Me and Jake were the couple. The kind of couple our friends saw and thought, if they can't make it, then there's no hope for the rest of us. Our relationship seemed so perfect from an outside perspective, and for a long time, it really was. We did not argue for months throughout the first year of our relationship, and everything seemed completely normal. That's until he completely changed. Jake started controlling little aspects of my life and eventually took over completely. He started telling me who I could and could not hang out with, but he did it so subtly. He'd tell me that none of my friends were real, and they'd take him from me if they had the chance. He started telling me I was lucky to have him, and I'd never find another man like him. I had to look nice when I came to see him, or he wouldn't even look at me. It got to the point that if I didn't want to have sex with him, then he'd get angry and tell me he worked hard that week and he deserved to get some sex with his girlfriend. If I didn't do it, I didn't respect him or our relationship. But I let him make me believe these things. And worst of all, I defended him. I was not allowed to see my friends. He accused me of sleeping with my friends and even my brothers. He accused my family of being horrible to him, even though he never came around. Then, the mind games kicked in full force. Jake started talking about moving in and having babies. If I didn't have a baby with him, he was going to have one way or another with another person. Keep in mind we were only 17 at the time. He started talking about getting married and moving in. Jake had lost his job and started staying with a friend a half an hour away, so his cheating accusations were constant. He stopped coming to see me, so I had to argue with my mom for hours to be able to go stay with him. All the while, dealing with his accusations and mental abuse. Jake would tell me horrible things. He'd threaten my family and my little brother. He'd threaten me. I didn't have a voice, though. I didn't know what to say or how to stand up for myself because I thought I needed him. He made me feel as though I had to have him in my life. Jake would then say other things to me. Call me stupid, cuss me out, tell me he could have anybody but settled for me. When I'd bring up how these things hurt me, he'd claim I was crazy and that he's never said any of those things. October of 2020, he accused me of cheating one last time. He said the only way to fix us was for him to be able to sleep with another girl. And he did it, a week before my 18th birthday. Words cannot describe how heartbroken I was. He told me on my lunch break at work, and I sat in my car, trying to convince myself I was the problem, and I had to change for him, because he said that would fix us. Worst of all, the girl was my friend. We had sleepovers together and selfies of each other posted online. I was completely shattered. He went into detail one night about the sex with her, and I lost it. The next day, he told me he never said those things and that he just lied about the details to hurt me. He called me crazy some more, and then claimed I deserved it. This is where the real story comes in. I met a coworker. We'll call him John. John was the brother of a friend from school, and we hit it off immediately in October. But I was in a relationship, and I was so desperate to fix things with Jake, I just really didn't pay any attention to him in that light. John and all my other coworkers started trying to convince me to break up with Jake, along with my family and friends. One of my closest friends and coworkers, we'll call her Sally, introduced me to the reality of gaslighting. She explained everything that Jake was doing to me and how I needed to get out of that relationship as quickly as possible. I was scared and told everybody I was going to do it, but it was just hard to leave Jake. I loved him. The last night I spent with Jake, he scared me so horribly I debated on walking home. The walk would have taken hours. See, Jake was very paranoid about cops. He did not live in a great part of town, so I didn't really see the big deal. But he woke me up to have sex anyway. He started choking me, and it was hard, and even left marks for a few days. I didn't think much of it at the time because I'm personally into choking a little bit, but it should have raised more red flags than it did at the time. But then he told me, if I find out you're a cop, I will shoot you in the face. I will not hesitate. He let go of my neck and stared at me until I cried. Then he told me to stop crying because I was the problem, and my family was the problem, and I shouldn't be the one that was upset. I was beyond terrified, and I felt so hopeless. I didn't fall back asleep. I was too scared. He tried to get me to smoke an illegal substance to fall asleep, but I refused. The next day, when I waited for my father to pick me up, he kissed me and whispered something in my ear between neck kisses. He said, "If you leave me, I'll have to kill you." At first, I thought nothing of it, but now it sends shivers down my spine. I broke things off a week later. I didn't know what to do. He begged me to stay, and I just thank God he lived so far and couldn't drive. I finally felt safe again. I never expected to see him again, until I did. He started lingering around a friend of my mom's house. He started sending me pics of my house, started showing up at work, asking coworkers about me. I was never working when he came in until yesterday. He walked in and we locked eyes. I booked it for the back, but he was right behind me. Not wanting to make a scene, I turned around to ask him what he wanted from me, tears in my eyes. He smiled and said, "I have to kill you now. You left me, you promised me you wouldn't, we belonged together." He started raising his voice, but I dismissed him and scurried to the back before things could get too serious. He calls me from different numbers now. 3 times yesterday and 6 times today. I blocked every number that calls, terrified. I've blocked him from social media, but that doesn't stop him. My new boyfriend, who is John by the way, has been so patient and understanding. But my ex sent me a picture of John's address written on a notepad and told me, "Don't mess with me. I know where he lives. Let me creep one last time. Please, it's been so long." I honestly don't know what to do. Any help would be appreciated because I'm absolutely terrified. Maybe this story wasn't super interesting, but I'm so scared. He makes me feel weak, and I know that, given the chance, he would probably actually kill me. If at any point throughout this story you said to yourself, "Wow, this sounds like my significant other," please get out as soon as you can. You do not need anybody who's going to treat you like that. You are so much stronger than you think. Nobody deserves to be treated like crap by another Jake. Never. And that goes for every single person listening to this podcast, male or female. Hey swamp folk, sorry to interrupt these stories, but I just have to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Blue Chew. It's summer, camping season. Let's talk about pitching tents. That's right, this episode is sponsored by Blue Chew. Guys, confidence can take you far in life. It can also help you in the bedroom, especially when it comes to step up to the plate. That's where Blue Chew comes in. Blue Chew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, but in chewable tablets and at a fraction of the cost. You can take them anytime, day or night, so you can plan ahead or be ready whenever an opportunity arises. The process is simple. Sign up at BlueChew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you'll receive your prescription within just a few days. The best part? It's all done online. So no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, and no waiting in the line at a pharmacy. Blue Chew tablets are made in the United States and prepared and shipped directly to your door in a discreet package. With Blue Chew, men everywhere are excited to see the postman, because when your package has arrived, your package has actually arrived. So, if you could benefit from extra confidence when it's time to perform, Blue Chew can help. And we've got a special deal for our listeners. Try Blue Chew free when you use our promo code SWAMPED at checkout. Just pay $5 shipping. That's BlueChew.com, promo code SWAMPED to receive your first month free. Visit BlueChew.com for more details and important safety information. And we thank Blue Chew for sponsoring the podcast. I believe this occurred a few years ago when my folks were driving themselves, me and my siblings, on a road trip from Texas to New York to visit family. At one point, which I believe was our first stop on the trip, we ended up at a McDonald's for either lunch or dinner. We all ordered what we wanted, and my mom, siblings, and I went to pick a table while my dad waited at the counter for our food. A table or two across from us, I noticed an old man sitting by himself. I remember the surrounding tables were empty, so he was just the first thing I noticed, and evidently would keep my attention until we left. I don't remember if he had any food, but he was just minding his own business. A few times he looked around at our table, kind of just in our general direction it seemed. Eventually my dad came back with the food and sat down with the rest of us. We all began to unpack our food and poke straws into our drinks. We were making casual conversation as we did so. It was at this point we all turned our attention a few tables away to the old man after hearing what sounded like loud muttering. He was saying something unintelligible, staring at us, his eyes as wide as could be. It no longer appeared he was looking in our general direction, but right at us, speaking what sounded like angry gibberish between gritted teeth. We all stopped talking at this point and tried to not stare back, awkwardly taking hesitant bites of our food. After a minute, one of us attempted to strike up conversation again, but it was definitely hard to do with this old guy making a scene that was obviously directed at us. It seemed after a couple of minutes of this weird behavior, the old guy had quieted down a bit. He was still talking, but it was quiet into himself. One of my siblings asked if they could have a ketchup for their fries. My mom didn't really want them going and getting it by themselves because she was super protective of her children, especially the younger of us. So my mom stood and walked over to where the ketchup was. The old man watched my mom go get the ketchup. The entire time his eyes were wide and staring blankly. He was quiet until she started to come back. The closer she got to our table, the louder his muttering got again. He sounded livid now and very intimidating. At that moment, I worried something was about to happen. Now, my dad had definitely had enough. He got up and walked over to the old man's table and said, "Do we have a problem?" As calm but as stern as he could. I think he said some other things to him as well, but much quieter as to not attract other people. The old man was still wide-eyed, and now his arms and legs were twitching. After a solid moment, the man shook his head no. After my dad gave him a stern look in the eye, as to make sure the guy knew he wasn't playing games, he returned to our table. We were told to hurry up and finish eating because my dad wanted to leave. The atmosphere felt so tense. No one conversed after this point. Another 2 or 3 minutes passed and the old man started talking again, just as loud and as angry as before. My dad locked eyes with him, with a very serious look on his face, which effectively quieted the guy down once more. You could tell that it was almost like he couldn't help it, and throughout the next few minutes, he was struggling to keep his voice to himself and his eyes on his own table. For some reason, it seemed that this guy, as worked up as he was, he just seemed to be upset that we were sitting in the restaurant. We finished eating and began cleaning up our trash. As we did so, people were entering and exiting the establishment. A couple of people with children got their food and went to the kids' play area. The old guy started to leave. He started to walk away from the table towards the exit, and I know we all breathed a sigh of relief. He was still muttering to himself and twitching angrily, but at least he was leaving us alone now. We thought that was it, but it wasn't. My dad was clearly in a bad mood now and rushing us all so we could get back on the road. No one knew what that guy's problem was or if he had been working up to doing something violent. I know that some people have issues, especially older folks, but what else were we to think? He had just seemed so pissed off for no apparent reason, and it was aimed at us for some reason. It was pretty alarming. My mom was hurrying us along to finish cleaning up our places at our table, but we were all too busy watching the strange old guy leave. That was when the old guy decided to enter the children's play area. My dad had been watching him as he walked away, perhaps for this exact reason. When my father saw him enter the kids' play area, he sprang out of his chair and sprinted over to the door of the room. I couldn't see exactly what happened, but I think the old guy noticed my dad had followed him and decided to take the exit that was inside the play area. We were done getting our stuff thrown away now. I think before we left, my dad made a point to mention this guy to the employees at the counter. Maybe he wouldn't have before, but why had he gone into that room with all the kids? It just seemed weird. We took our leave and didn't come across this guy again. No sign of him outside anywhere. No one seems to remember this incident now, or at least it's just never been brought up since, but it was definitely a scary experience. This is my first time ever sharing a story on this show. It may not sound scary, but I thought it was at least. I am 23 years old now, but I still remember this experience like it happened to me yesterday. I am a male, and I think I was probably in the first grade, about 6 or 7 years old on Halloween night. My parents took my little sister and I to trick-or-treat, and I remember feeling super excited. Halloween was always one of my favorite holidays. I remember we went to this rich person's neighborhood, because they always gave out the best candy. I remember we went to the rich people's neighborhood because they always gave out the most candy. I remember I got a bit too excited and went on ahead on my own, and as a kid, I was amazed at everyone's costume. I would often go up to random people, look up at them, and compliment them on their costume. I know it wasn't a good idea to do so, especially being on my own and being so young, but I was a kid, and so I didn't really know much better. One of the people had a scary mask on, and I was blown away at how cool it looked, and I had to tell them. So I did. I went up to him and told him how much I liked his mask, and he stared at me for a few seconds. He pulled out his arm and grabbed onto my hand with a tight grip. I tried to pull away, but he wasn't letting go. Instead, he continued to keep walking while holding on to me. I was so terrified that this stranger wasn't letting go and was taking me somewhere with him. I started screaming, but the crowds and crowds of people didn't even realize what was happening. I was looking all over the place trying to find my parents, and I managed to see my mom in the crowd not too far behind me. She also saw me and was calling out while trying to get through the crowd. The stranger must have noticed because he immediately let go and took off very quickly. I caught up with my mother, and for some reason, I decided not to tell her what happened. It was only until a few years ago I brought it up, and she said that I never told her about it and was surprised about it. It is scary knowing that people out there kidnap kids in front of everybody and does God knows what to them. I was lucky enough to have found my mom when I did. This happened in South Texas to my uncle in the late 80s or maybe early 90s. He has never been one to fib or tell nonsense tales, so I know that this is entirely true, and he still has a distant look in his eyes when he retells us the story. One warm, very humid South Texas night, he left his house due to disagreements with his wife. They were having marital problems at the time, so he always left to go take a drive rather than stay home and make the situation worse. This one night, he decided to go to the old cemetery in town where his father was buried. His father passed away when he was a young boy, and the town has a new cemetery on the outskirts of town where most people visit, so this graveyard was always dark and mostly abandoned. He sat by his father's grave and just vented his situation and let it all out. He felt a calmness to just be able to talk about his problems, even though no one else was around to hear them. He knew his father was listening to him though, and he took comfort in that. After maybe a couple of hours, my uncle saw a light in the distance, and he thought it was maybe a groundskeeper or security guard, and because it was already early morning hours, he figured it was time to leave. He would leave as soon as the flashlight got closer to him, and just explain that he was not there to vandalize or do harm. But the light never got bigger, like a flashlight would if someone holding it would get closer. The light also started to weave back and forth, as it was like dancing or jumping from side to side. My uncle kept an eye on it, and it soon got really close. He realized it was not a flashlight at all or a firefly. There was nothing around it or inside the light. It was just floating a close distance near him, and my uncle stared at it for what seemed like a long time. Before he knew it, my uncle had a sudden urge of fear rush through him, and he started running to his car. The light followed him, but kept a distance away. He ran as fast as he could, and before he got to his car, he turned back one last time and it was gone. When he turned to reach for his door handle, the light was between him and the car. That is when he saw that it was no firefly due to no bug being around it or anything. It was just a ball of light, exceedingly small that it could fit into the palm of his hand or something like that. He ran around to the passenger side and quickly jumped in and closed the door, locking it behind him. He saw the light floating around his car, and then it got in front of the car near the hood. My uncle managed to turn his car on, put it in reverse at full speed, and sped away towards the entrance rather than the exit. He saw the light following him, and then it just turned off, like someone flicked a switch. He was getting out of there as fast as he could. He was not going to stay in those cemetery grounds for a second longer. He sped away and kept checking his rearview mirror to make sure it was gone. It was at maybe a minute away that he heard a deep sigh come from his back seat. He said it sounded like a man's sigh, and he refused to look in his mirror or check. He just looked forward, gripping the steering wheel, and quickly drove home. He told the story to his mother the next day. He was still very shaken up about it. His mother told him that maybe it was his father, and sensing that my uncle was going through a rough time, his father came to visit him. My uncle convinced himself that maybe it was that. He eventually came to his senses a few nights later and went back to see if his father would return. He never saw that light again or felt that fear he had inside of him when he returned. Hey Swamp Dweller, I've been listening to your channel for a while now. I came across it during the pandemic, and it has been a saving grace for my sanity. I have a story in which I will use fake names, as I'm uncertain whether my friends want their names posted. My name will also be fake. I'm going to send the scarier encounters I've had in the future as well if you would like to hear about those. I've had what you can call many ghost encounters, and I'm happy to share them. The stories I'm going to describe are true, and you can find the real locations on a map and even find news articles about one of the places. We will start with the burned down house. My name is Charlotte. Me and friends would regularly explore a very old burned down house. Let me give you the setting. It is North Texas, near the Oklahoma border. The burned down house is one of those huge plots of lands that was probably once farmland or cattle grazing fields. It's a massive property. It is on the side of a large 4-lane highway that runs between DFW and Oklahoma. There is a few decent-sized cities about 15 minutes away from this burned-down house with about probably 100,000 people or more. But once out of town and on the highway, it becomes really rural very fast, and you almost immediately feel like you are in the middle of nowhere. The turnoff for the burned-down house is exceedingly difficult to see, as it is literally just a dirt path perpendicular to the road. Railroad tracks run parallel to the road, and one must park between the tracks and the entry gate to get to the driveway of the house, meaning if a train comes, you are stuck there until it moves. To get to the house, one must park their car by the tracks and abandon it, and then walk a quarter mile or more up this dirt driveway. The exterior walls of the house are decently intact, as it was made of stone and brick. It burned down sometime around 1975, but there is zero part of the roof left, at all. Entirely open to the stars above, behind the main house is a garage with an attached room or shop that was spared most of the fire damage as it was pretty far behind the main house. There is a huge grain silo about 50 yards away that is also fully intact. So, for the story. Most of the time we visited this place, it was super creepy, but rather uneventful. The reason this place is haunted is because of that fire. Two brothers had a large coin collection valued at a lot of money. They donated them to a museum, but the people who murdered them were unaware. Their house was burned down to steal this coin collection that had already been donated, and well, the two brothers died. So, 5 of us are at my friend's house getting ready for our midnight adventure. We will call that friend Leah. Leah did not really believe in the supernatural at all, but found the adventure and the possibility of finding something cool along the way worth her time, so she always tagged along. Then we had Jeff, Jessica, and Karina. As the 5 of us are readying for our adventure, this was around 2011 by the way, Leah finds a ghost detector app to download on her phone that is supposed to pick up electromagnetic waves. None of us believe this will work because why would it? Before we leave, she decides to load up the app and take a magnet from the fridge to see if anything happens, and to our surprise, the little bars went up. Think like how you have radiation detectors and that goes up in colored bars. It's the same thing. We all have a good laugh and make a joke about how if there are any magnets left at the burned down house, we will find them. We set off with me driving. I always drove because I was the only one with a car usually. We arrive, carefully pull over, and park. We quickly turn lights off so we are not spotted because this is trespassing. We hop the fence and begin the slight incline of the dirt driveway. Alas, we make it to the house, but before we go in, we decide to check out the grain silo as not everyone in the group had been here yet, and they wanted to see absolutely everything this place had to offer. We check out the creepy garage and make our way back to the front of the burned down house. We all step inside and begin looking around, just admiring the sad beauty of this place. The house is not very large, and what used to be a fireplace is pretty much smack dab in the middle of this house, with small foliage growing out of it. We are all standing there, kind of doing our own thing and checking the stuff out. Leah decides this is a perfect time to turn on her ghost detector app, and let me tell you what, Swamp Dweller, not even one of us was prepared for what happened next. I want to also say, this land is very flat with minimal trees and nowhere to really hide. So, we had walked around the entirety of this structure probably 3 or more times, with not an animal peep or shuffle of any sort. So Leah turns on her ghost app, and lo and behold, she is waving it in the air, not close to anything, and it starts going off. We all kind of laugh because, okay, sure. About 5 seconds after the detector went crazy, a large rock or loose brick from the house hits the wall outside. Everyone does their thing where they look around to see who is missing from the group, but we were all there. Less than 5 feet apart from one another. No one could have run out of the house, thrown that large object, and made it back in without hearing the footsteps and movement, as we were all way too close to each other. And, being that there was no roof at all, we should have heard footsteps or some other sound that would have indicated someone was there. We always took flashlights out there, and there was no one out there. We searched very, very well. After our terrifying realization of, that couldn't have been an animal because the brick hit way too high on the wall, and how did we not hear or see anyone out there? We bolted. We started running full speed to the driveway. About halfway down the driveway, we kind of cooled off and started just walking and enjoying again. What terrified me the most about this night wasn't even the brick, though that was truly terrifying. What scared me the most is that as we were walking back to the car, Leah bolts past us running full speed. Leah does not like to run. She does not believe in the paranormal either, so it's weird to see this. She is very calm and literally plays horror games and loves horror movies. She does not scare easily, and she was running for her life out of nowhere. So I start running too because I think we are being chased by a psycho human or a coyote. When we finally make it to the car, I open the doors and everybody gets in. I look at Leah like, what the hell are you doing, dude? And I said, why were you running? Still terrified, she says, it was nothing. I'm like, dude, that was not nothing. What did you see? She said I saw this bush, but something behind it moved, and I just kept telling myself it was the bush, but I do not think it was. There was no wind that night. The bushes had no greenery because it was just before spring when everything blooms. It took us a while to go back there. We managed all to make it out of there safely, but to this day, I have no idea how the brick got thrown. I have no idea what we saw in the bushes, and I'm absolutely terrified of what could be lurking out there. I have another encounter from a haunted school that was abandoned in the 1920s if you would like me to submit that one as well. It was also in North Texas. Thank you for sharing my story. I live in north central Texas in a rural area. My hometown has less than 900 people. The next big town is probably a good few miles away. Most of the land is cleared out and barren pastures for cattle. Any land not cleared is covered in thickets of barbed up mosquito trees and thick, wiry woods, especially up and around the lake. We live right on the lake, a 10-minute walk down to the water. It's all grown up thick down there, except the areas we clear out for fishing spots. Several little islands covered in thick woods are throughout that lake as well. Pretty often, I would go with my stepdad in the kayaks, or our little rowboat, and we would just go run jug lines. From where we got in, we could go past some of the tiny islands and up the channel that led into the creeks in town just a few miles away. We always had airsoft pistols to scare off snakes from getting in our boats, and one of us would always have a small revolver or a rifle to scare off whatever else. We always went out late at night, around 11 p.m. or midnight, when the catfish and shad start feeding, and would stay out there for quite a few hours. We did not have to worry about anything in the water. But if we got out on a certain baby island or on the kind of sandbar areas in the middle of the channel, you had to watch for pigs, bobcats, mountain lions, and snakes. I had seen the pigs before. We are overrun with them, and some years ago, they started to get even bigger than we had normally known them to be. They had certain areas they stayed in though, so we did not worry about them too terribly much. The bobcats would run when we saw them, most of the time, and honestly, if you stand up to show off your size, most things like that will just go the opposite way. The mountain lions were less common, but sometimes you could see their eyes in the dark. They will stalk your boat if they can, but they usually won't bother if you're in the water. One pop with the rifle and they usually scurry off. They are freaky though. We can hear them miles away. They sound like a woman screaming. I imagine they are what banshees sound like. So there are a few things to worry about, but not too much. There is nothing bigger either. There is nothing like bears here, and if there is one, no one has ever seen it or reported it. This one night, a few months ago, we went out and one of my stepdad's friends came along. It was a good night. We had just baited and dropped all of our jugs, and we rowed the boat to one of the more cleared bars so we could get out and go to the bathroom. I stayed in the boat with one of the guns in the spotlight so I could watch for pigs and snakes. It was easy to scare yourself out here, seeing things pass by the trees. You just have to ignore it most of the time. They were not gone long before I could hear crunches and snaps out in the distance. I yelled to them what I heard because if it was something that big, it's usually pigs. I yelled to them what I had heard because usually if it's that loud, it's gonna be pigs. My stepdad and his friend did not answer though. They were probably out exploring. He had always done that. Trekking around here had never bothered him since he grew up trekking through Mississippi. I did not hear the sounds anymore, but I watched the thickets harder while I untied the boat in case they needed to just run. I felt like they were gone 20 minutes or so, and I was getting incredibly anxious. Finally, I could hear my stepdad and his friend yelling in the distance. The closer they got, I could hear the crunches again louder, while he yelled at me to untie the boat like I already had done. He kept yelling at me to get the rifle up, and to get on the far side of the boat. I was freaking out. When I could finally see them clearing their way through, the sounds were behind them, and it was getting louder. I realized it was not the underbrush being crunched down, but it was the sound of tree limbs snapping and cracking. It was so loud when my stepdad jumped in the boat. He kept yelling at me to keep aiming while he started the motor. His friend was already paddling us away from the shore into the middle of the channel. I could still hear the sounds, but I never saw a thing. Nothing ever followed us into the water. After that, we left the jugs and took his friend straight back to the cars. He was shaking so hard he just bolted up to the cars. My stepdad had calmed down by then, and we went back to get the jug lines. He steered the boat and held the rifle while I pulled the lines up. He would never answer me when I asked what happened. He just said it was a big pig. He had told me about it one time, but I noticed he was keeping us in the dead center of the channel. All the lines we had near the shore, he would never tell me to go get them. He said they were probably empty and we will get them another time. When we were pulling everything back to the house, we took it all together at once instead of the several trips we would usually make. He told me not to tell my mom, but he did not know what it was, and he had not wanted to scare me while we were still out there. He told me they were looking on the bar for good spots on the far side when they heard it coming and it chased them all the way back. He said it was so loud and it was definitely big. It would be way too big for it to be a bear or something like that. We don't have Bigfoot stories or anything like that around here, so we don't know what it is, but we really have not been fishing that far up the channel ever since. I have worked for the United States Forest Service here in Texas for just shy of 10 years now. I love my job, and it is rare for anything particularly creepy or scary to occur. But having worked this job for so long, I have my fair share of stories I can share that might just make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. For example, we sometimes get jaguars hunting in the forest here, a particularly scary big cat, and that is because of what they do to their prey once they are caught and subdued. So just picture the scene. You are walking through the trees on some bright, sunny day, when suddenly you start to smell something rotten. You look around, but there's nothing to be seen. It's just this grotesque, terrible smell. All you see around you are these picturesque view of pines and the sound of birdsong floating through the green. Then something hits the top of your head. Something wet. You place a hand on the top of your head, feeling something cold and slimy dribbling through your hair. You bring your hand down to see what it is, hoping it's not bird poo. Only, it is something way worse. It's blood. You look up, and hanging up in a tree just above your head is a mutilated, half-eaten corpse of an animal. Guts torn out, skin shredded, face half-eaten with hooves or paws missing, with broken pieces of bone protruding from cracked limbs. It seems an utterly bizarre thing to do, but the jaguar has a good reason for doing all of this heavy lifting. If a jaguar does not bother to hoist its kill into a tree, it risks losing its meal to other more ground-based predators or scavengers. Creepy, yeah, but that kind of natural world stuff is nothing compared to some of the other stuff I've encountered during my time in the Forest Service. So this other time, I am on a routine walk, going through some of the trails to make sure all the directional signs and informational markers for tourists are all in order. There is a large rock protrusion about 100 meters from this trail. It's like this big sandstone boulder that juts out of the earth that has kind of like a shallow cave carved out of it. It's been worn away from thousands of years of wind erosion. After I get closer, I see a guy in what I first thought was camouflage hunting gear hanging around the entrance. I call out to him, just some friendly greeting, nothing threatening, and he turns to look at me. Only he does not say a word, he just runs off through the trees. I start getting worried about what he was doing in the cave, terrified he has left a body or something there, and honestly, I thank God he had not. But it does seem like he left something behind. I mean, I'm honestly not 100% sure it was him that did this, and I often considered the possibility that it was him that happened across the little find first, and seeing me, he got the idea in his head that it was me that left that thing there. He got the idea into his head, saw me, and just freaked out. But when I walked into the little cave and shined my flashlight around, I saw something that would completely explain why he was so quick to run away, whatever his motivations were. Teeth. There was a little circular patch of dirt, one that looked like it had been raked over to clear some space, and in the middle of it all were a bunch of human teeth. I do not know why they were there. I do not know who left them or why. But I did what I could. I gathered them up into a little plastic bag I had on me that I had previously had my lunch in, and took them down to the nearest police station, giving a little description of the guy that I had seen run away from the cave. I have the usual wild animal encounters, weird noises during the night, but I have never forgotten those teeth. I have no explanation to offer up at all, but it certainly does make for a good little campfire story. I'm going to preface this story by saying that I'm currently a 19-year-old girl, and when this story occurred, I was 14. In the summer of 2016, my grandmother, 2 younger sisters, and I drove 19 hours to San Antonio in Texas. My great-aunt lives there, and my recently deceased great-uncle lived there too. We were all going to visit my grandmother's oldest brother, as he had never really spent much time with us before. We spent the entire trip going out and about this military retirement home that my great-uncle lived in. We went to a neat little area. It had this little thrift shop that was part of the community, and I bought an old letter opener, which I pretended was a dagger to freak out my friends. The trip went well. We were there for about a week. We said our goodbyes to our distant relatives, and my grandmother told my sisters and me that she wanted to visit the Holocaust Museum before we left Texas and started our long drive home. The museum had and still has a picture of her father in it. He was one of the first doctors to go to Dachau, which was a concentration camp, and the picture was taken in front of a rather large pile of innocent people whose lives were stolen at Dachau, while my great-grandfather stands behind them with a look of sorrow. My sister and I readily agreed to go. We wanted our sweet little grandma to see a picture of her daddy. She was extremely excited to show us the photo. We eventually arrived at the Holocaust Museum, and it was devastatingly beautiful. The overall mood of the museum was very somber, and the walls were lined with photos from concentration camps and various other things that were present during the Holocaust. As we started our tour through the museum, I realized I had to use the restroom. Curse my tiny, 14-year-old bladder, but I decided I would hold it until we were finished with the tour. Little did I know, the tour would take about an hour. I suffered through most of the tour, and distracted myself by listening to people who worked at the museum and listening to my grandma recall stories from her father. There were a few people scattered about the museum as we walked through it. The lights were somewhat dim, as most museum lights were. I noticed that it was oddly quiet though. Most people were very empathetic, as was I throughout the tour. Near the end of the tour, my grandma finally found the photo she wanted to show us. She pointed to it excitedly and told the workers, "That's my daddy." She went on to tell the worker about her father and what he did at the place, and at this moment, I realized I really had to use the restroom. My siblings were looking at me funny as I frantically searched for the bathroom. My sister, I will call her Jay, pointed to a restroom not far from where we stood. I told my sisters that I would be right back, and I practically ran to the restroom. I opened the door expecting it to be vacant, but to my demise it was packed with women who were babbling on about nothing important to a 14-year-old. Now, I do not know if it was something wrong with me psychologically, but I absolutely cannot use a random restroom when other people are present. It has always been an issue, and it still is. You can imagine how rough that can be in certain situations. I resigned to waiting for the mass of women to leave the restroom, and as luck would have it, the women all left in about 5 minutes. There were about 6 stalls in this restroom, the handicap stall being to the far left. I rushed into the stall directly next to it and practically threw myself into the toilet. Except, as I sat there, I began to have an eerie feeling. I held my breath. The restroom was completely silent, and I knew it should be because everybody had left, but something churned in my stomach. The silence was deafening. I felt sick, like the air was becoming thicker. Someone could have cut a knife through it. Something was not right. I needed to get out of this stall. I did not even use the toilet. I just scrambled from the stall, assessed the restroom, and I was just trying to see what was happening. Everything seemed alright. I did not see anyone. The stall doors were closed, and yet I still felt scared. I went to wash my hands, as I always would wash my hands even if I did not actually need to. Something inside me told me to look at the handicap stall. I do not know what persuaded me to look, but I did. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. I slowly leaned back to get a better look at the stall, and my heart dropped. I know people claim that their heart sinks or drops or they freeze with fear, and all of what they claim is definitely true. My heart jumped to my throat and I suddenly felt ill. What I saw was a leg on the floor, a child's leg. It was attached to somebody, but I was too scared to investigate any further. I ran from the restroom to my younger sisters. I do not know why I did this. I was a dumb 14-year-old, but I needed my sisters to confirm what I had just seen. They were skeptical when I told them. I dragged my sisters back to the restroom with me, begging them to be quiet, and I pointed to the handicap stall. My youngest sister, I will call her N, looked at me in alarm, and then Jay did the same. There was long hair next to the leg now, almost as if there was somebody crouching to look under the stall at us, but at the same time, they were completely still, unnaturally still. I grabbed both of my sister's hands and urgently pulled them from the restroom. We ran up to my grandma, and all 3 of us started rambling at once. The worker by my grandmother looked at all of us with concern. I eventually explained the situation to the kind woman who worked there, and she looked very unsettled. I watched as she went to the large, burly security guard. He looked from her to us and said he would go look. We waited, with my grandmother for quite a while the worker and the security guard came back. He exited the woman's restroom quickly and rushed to speak to the worker. A man was speaking on his phone in there. The security guard spoke slowly. My heart seemed to drop a little bit more. I definitely saw a child's leg in there. there was not a man in there too, was there? I thought. The woman glanced at my sisters and me before listening to the security guard again. The security guard confirmed that there were 2 people in the handicap stall, and by this point, my grandmother was freaked out, enough to say that it was time for us to leave. The security guard had readily agreed. I am sorry that we did not stick around to find out what that man was doing in the woman's restroom, and the handicap stall with a child on the floor. I did not get to find out why or what happened to that man, and I still wonder why they were so silent that I could not hear them breathing in the stall next to me, or why he was on the phone after I rushed out. I will say though, that this experience left me with an even bigger fear of public restrooms. And since I have such a wild imagination, I did not sleep that night. Images of that leg and the thoughts of someone trying to peek at me under the stall haunted me for a long time. If any of you have ever been in a situation like that, do not go back in. Just get help and always trust your instincts. I grew up in a small town near Raleigh, North Carolina, on the kind of road where tax collectors show up and are never seen again. The lots were all 2+ acres, with giant wooded nature preserves behind it. There were 3 main families that lived on the road, so my family, coming in from Connecticut in the summer of 1990, stuck out like a sore thumb. But they were all exceedingly kind to us. One old man, who had my parents' house 2 owners prior, was seriously named Stonewall Jackson Harrison. He told the most stories about my house, and it was apparently the second house that was built there. The first one had burned down mysteriously, with the owners inside. Evidently, the street was far less welcoming to new neighbors a few generations prior. The second house, the one I grew up in, was built in the 1930s. Apparently, it was like a Sears catalog style, with old scraps of wood from the nearby lumber mill that used to exist down the street. My dad was a carpenter, and we ended up renovating it from a small single-story bungalow into a 2-story Victorian with a tower and wraparound porch. Over the course of 20 years or so, the more we renovated, the less spooky stuff we saw around the house and land. And the old heart of the house, where the hallway used to exist between the 2 bedrooms and the sole bathroom, stayed original until the day we sold it in 2016. No matter what time of day it was, you almost always saw the bottom edges of long, ruffled dresses or old trousers as they walked into one of those 3 doorways. Once I saw a full-body man standing in the doorway in the reflection of a mirror on the opposite wall, with a red shirt, dark pants, and dark hair, with a full beard, while I was messing with my hair as a dorky teenage girl. I honestly thought it was my father at first, since red was his favorite color, and he had a similar hairstyle, and I actually turned around in the middle of a conversation I was starting with him, until I realized there was no one in the doorway, or in the house at all, and that the man was so tall, his head had almost brushed up against the top of the doorway, at least 6 inches taller than my dad ever was. I never saw that man ever again. I have 2 younger brothers, and when we first moved in, they lived in the attic that my dad finished for them as a makeshift shared room, until we created a full 2nd floor. My brother, who is closest in age to me, by a year and a half my junior, has always been sensitive to energy, and for the first summer we lived there, something woke him up almost every single night of the week for a month straight. I know all the legends say it's 3 a.m., but it was always 2 a.m. at that house. Maybe they lived before daylight saving time or something. My brother dealt with it for weeks before finally admitting it to me. Something had been shaking him awake several nights a week, always around 2 a.m., for weeks on end. Being the protective eldest sister I was upset with this ghost for bothering my brother's sleep. After all, if anyone was going to annoy my little brother, it was going to be me. So, I did what any sane 10-year-old girl would do. I wrote the ghost a very sternly worded letter, telling it that if it wanted to bother anyone, it needed to pick a fight with me. After that night, my brother seemingly was never awakened by this ghost or being or entity or whatever it was ever again. Many other odd things did happen in the house after that point, however. Once we casually tossed a pair of boots out of the treehouse when we got tired of trying to sleep in it overnight, and we found them carefully laid by the side in the grass, 20 feet away, as though they were carefully placed there. Another time, a friend and I used a Ouija board in my bedroom, one of the 2 original rooms that we had never changed the whole time we lived there, and asked if there were secrets hidden anywhere in the house. It spelled out rake and roof. My friend and I ran outside and started looking at the roof, searching for a garden tool on the shingles, as though that made sense. My dad was working on the roof at the time and asked what we were doing. When we told him we were looking for a rake on the roof, he froze for a second and did a double take. That word hasn't been used in a very long time, but about 100 years ago or so, the overhang of our roof used to be called the rake of the roof. It took me weeks before I explained to my dad that my mom's old Ouija board from the 70s taught me the term. By that time, he had already taken the old roof off the house and gotten rid of the old debris, so I never learned what may have been hidden in or written on anything in the original roof's overhang. Occasionally, things would get more personal. After my dad's dad died, he visited me in my dreams in the backyard of that house, even though I was not living there then, to make sure I was doing okay. The same way he used to do when he'd call me every Friday when I lived alone in my early 20s. When my mom's mom died, my brother woke up within an hour of her death, claiming she had called him on the phone to say goodbye. My mom found out my grandmother had died about an hour or 2 later. When my dad's youngest brother died, he got woken up around the same time my uncle passed and heard the doorbell, even though it was not functional at the time. After some time, we all just got used to it. My brother used to have parties in the backyard, and I'd meet people years later upon realizing where I used to live, and they would actually say, "That house is so creepy, you couldn't pay me to go back there." It happened several times over the years, but I guess writing a very sternly worded letter to a ghost at a young age made them treat me and my family with an odd measure of respect. Anyway, that is my story. It was my summer break. I was 15 at the time and my older sister was 16. My mother decided to go visit my grandmother and grandfather in Mexico. We would visit the small town in Luvianos, which was the town closest to their ranch. The ranch was about 15 miles away from the town in a little secluded and hidden area in the mountains and hills. There was little law enforcement at the time, and the people of the town decided to create their own law enforcement, which I found a little uncomforting. We flew into Mexico City, and then took a car ride for about 3 or 4 hours to the town, and then another ride to where my mother lived. For a few days, everything was great. I would wake up early, go herd the cows from a massive hill, and corral them and milk them, enjoy the views and relax. I remember the exact date and time of this encounter, because I had my phone in hand. It was Thursday. I could not sleep, so I decided to watch some anime until I got sleepy. I had downloaded some episodes for the occasion. After a couple of hours watching, I needed to use the restroom. The restroom was not inside the house, but outside in a little hut-type thing. The house had a massive tree beside it, where they had little chicken corralled. The restroom was in the front of the house, but to the right of it. The tree is a tall ceiba with no branches until it reaches the canopy. It was 3:24 a.m., and I left the house while staring at my phone when my body froze. I was halfway to the restroom when my heart started pumping, as if I was running a triathlon. I looked up from my phone to the tree to see this thing staring at me. It looked like a person, or at least its silhouette did. I somehow came over the fear that froze me and slowly walked into the restroom. Its eyes were blank, almost like the thing was unconscious, but they felt threatening at the same time. I did not believe in anything supernatural at the time, although cryptids did interest me. I was always a skeptic, so me being a dumb, rational thinker, thought I was just being dumb and decided to use the restroom and watch anime. Until a few minutes passed, and I heard a thump, and I felt the ground shake a little. It had jumped from the tree to the ground in front of the restroom. I felt trapped, and I started to have a little bit of a panic attack. when I accidentally turned off the light in the restroom. I held my breath and tried to calm myself when I heard footsteps slowly getting farther. I felt a sudden relief and calmed down. I waited about 15 minutes to leave the restroom and go back into the house. In the morning, while we were all at the table having breakfast, I asked my mom if she heard anything last night, and she replied with a confused no. My sister looked at me like an idiot and mocked me. I asked my grandfather if he has seen anything late at night in the trees. He told me about the lizards and occasional raccoon, but I knew what I saw was much larger than both. I explained what I saw and he gave me a worried look. He soon got up and muttered, "Again?" under his breath. Later in the day, I saw him in the back of the house burning some herbs and looking around. My grandmother set out a little statue of the Virgin Mary. Nothing else seemingly happened for the rest of that trip, but to this day, looking on the internet for what I saw, I do not know what it was. I wanted to share this to see if anybody else has had a similar experience. I am from Saluda, South Carolina, an incredibly old and rural country town, steeped in Indian history. My grandparents are descendants of sharecroppers. They have been on the land for over a century and a half. We used to go from the city to the country every summer from Atlanta to South Carolina in the country. It was a very set schedule. Wake up, eat, go outside, play, come back at noon, get back out and play. No in and out kind of stuff. Dusk comes, we all go up and wash up, eat, pray, and go to sleep. My brother and I would run off into the field and play all day, skip rocks at lakes, shoot squirrels and rabbits with BB guns. We would eat berries, all sorts of fun. Well, in one part of the pasture, there was a circle of trees and bushes that even the cows would not go in. Our grandmother told us that it was an Indian burial ground or something, and we were to stay out of it. It was off limits. Every summer, we went up to South Carolina. My brother and I got closer and closer to that strange place. We could see staffs and hanging skulls and feathers and strange tombstones and crows and all these weird artifacts all around. It seemed like the closer we got, the more eerie it became. We could hear strange sounds, like that of distant drumming or something like that. Every so often, I swear we would see apparitions of a chief. It would always be in the distance though, and then sometimes we would see a lone eagle or hawk flying overhead, cawing at us as we got ready to enter the patch. Well, we told our grandmother about it, and she told us to stay out of there, that we should not disturb the dead, or bad things would happen. Being a kid, I was hard-headed, and one day, coming back from a pond, fishing, I walked past the cemetery. I ran up to it, slowing down the closer I got, and could see all the same things, the staffs, the feathers, the Indian arrowheads, the bones, etc. This time I grabbed one of the arrowheads and ran off. I went back to the house. When I got in, I went into my room to examine it, and my grandmother yelled, "Y'all get ready to eat lunch." I stashed the arrowhead under my mattress before I could look at it and eat. After eating, my grandmother was in the kitchen and said, "Son, I told you to stay out of that cemetery." I said I was not in it, Grandma. She said, "Yes, you were. I know you were." I got silent and thought of how she could possibly know. You cannot see the cemetery from the house nor at any vantage point. She has not been in my room because she was in the kitchen the entire time. After I finished eating and was about to head out, she said, "If you got anything from up there, you better take it back." I said, "No, ma'am, I do not," and hurried out the door as I played for the remainder of the afternoon. I felt so uneasy. How did she know that was going to happen? Later that evening, I came in, washed up for dinner, and sat and ate. It was a rather silent night. I sensed an odd feeling. My brother and I said our prayers and we were off to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear little noises. I thought it must just be an old mouse that scurries along the wall. As I was trying to sleep, my eyes got heavy, and I saw my grandma coming down the hall. But as she got closer, it was not her. It was some sort of demon. It had these stringy clothes on and walked straight into the room. Once it got on my bed, I tried to scream but I could not. I tried to call for my brother, who was on the top bunk, but my mouth was covered by the thing. It was laughing and sobbing in my mouth. I thought I was going to die. I was absolutely scared to death, and I passed out as it choked me to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to my brother saying it was time to eat. He hopped down and ran for the bathroom, thinking I was going to chase him for who's first like every other morning. But I was still in shock. When I finally got to the table, my grandmother asked me how we both slept. My brother said that he had an awful dream that something had broken in. I honestly just didn't say anything. I was way too scared. She said that if we ever go back in there and touch anything, we should never bring it back. We should stay out of there regardless, but if we ever do, don't bring anything back. I am currently in my late 20s, but at the time of these events my 8th grade school year had just ended. I was excited that I was going to be able to spend the entire summer with my 2 closest buddies, and that we would be heading into the 9th grade together. We did not really do much other than just hang out, play PS2, play some basketball outside, and message girls from our class on Instant Messenger. Which I hope most of you remember what that was. If not, then I guess I'm getting way too old. We would usually hang out at my house because my parents were always cool with my friends being there, and the way my house was set up, we pretty much had a ton of privacy, which was awesome for teenage boys being idiots. My house at the time was located on a quiet street, but my neighborhood was near the regular, rougher sections of my hometown. A close walk from my house was a corner store that sold cheap soda, chips, and candy. This was obviously a frequent destination for me and my friends. Well, about a week after 8th grade ended, my 2 buddies were staying overnight like they always did. We thought it would be a cool idea to sneak out of the house after my parents went to sleep and walk to the corner store a few blocks away. Of course, not to do anything crazy, but just to have the thrill of being out late on our own. And being a foolish teenager, I had no awareness of the danger I was potentially putting myself and friends in. Around 11, my parents went to sleep, and that is when we decided to sneak out of the house. At first, the thrill of being out was awesome, but the feeling would soon change when we got to the store. We went in there with about $20, and we planned on spending it on a whole bunch of snacks. We all split up to grab certain things. I was in the back corner looking at the soda when I saw somebody lurking in the opposite corner. The only reason why this was concerning to me was because he was facing me, and not facing the shelves or products. I pretended I did not notice him because who knows, maybe it was just a coincidence. As I looked at the Faygo sodas, I noticed in the reflection of the cooler that a shadowy figure was now moving closer, and still facing me. I quickly grabbed my 2-liter soda and went and found my friends. I darted away, and when I looked back, the figure was standing right there, where I was just a moment ago, and still facing me. I was freaked out, but I did not want to let my friends know that I was. I also want to add that there was nobody else in the store other than us, the cashier, and whoever this person was. We grabbed our stuff and cashed out. I was trying to be quick about it, but my friends were being stupid and loud, perhaps trying to show off, but honestly, I was just freaking out. We started the several blocks walk home. I was moving good, and finally my friend stopped and asked what my problem was. I told them what happened in the store, and they seemed a little bit rattled as well. We continued moving quickly. My house was maybe only 100 feet away at this point, when we noticed that the person from the store was now rushing full speed up the hill at us. We ran as fast as we could. Lucky for us, the lunatic was still quite a ways away. We ran into the front door, and for some reason, still tried to be quiet as to not wake my parents. We turned and locked the door, made sure the lights were off. The person reached my house and started to bang on the door angrily. That is when I finally gave into logic and woke my parents up, who immediately called the authorities. I tried yelling through the door that we called the cops, and the person did not seem to respond. He just kept trying to open the door and continued banging on it. After another few minutes, he eventually took a decorative stone from our front yard and broke the window next to the front door. That is when I finally got a good look at the guy. He tried to climb into the window, and the broken glass knocked his hood off. He was completely expressionless. He had dirty blonde hair, was clean shaven, and honestly looked like an average Joe. He was about halfway through the window when my dad came out with a bat and started swinging at him. Before there was too much of a struggle, we saw the lights and heard sirens. The cops got out of the car screaming and pulled the man out of the window. It was the most intense thing I've ever seen in front of my eyes. The man was obviously arrested. Apparently he had no criminal history and had no history of drugs or alcohol. When questioned by the cops, he said, "Honestly, I was just bored, and I just wanted to be a little devil, I guess." We had no idea what his intentions were, but just felt incredibly lucky that we somehow came out of that physically unharmed. Mentally, I still think about that night over a decade later. I used to stay up for hours thinking if we were not far ahead of him, who knows what he would have done to us. He probably would have hurt us pretty bad. I also used to stay up late at night fearing that he would show up at my house again when I least expected it. It just goes to show that even the most harmless of decisions can sometimes lead to consequences you regret the most. If you're like me, staying home alone every day in the summer can become a drag. I've always been someone who needs to stay busy all the time. I don't like being alone, and I like to always be active. Last year, after finishing my freshman year of college, I decided to take a summer job to make some extra cash. I worked for a landscaping company, but the pay was under the table. I won't put the name of the company, but the owner seemed eager to get the hell on immediately, so I figured perhaps I'd become a full-time employee later in the summer. For the time being, he agreed to pay me based off the different jobs we did. For the first few weeks, it was great. I was getting super tan and jacked from all the lifting. The first 3 weeks he paid me, and I was getting paid quite well. But by the time we got to the 4th week is when things started to get a bit weird. He usually paid me on Friday, but he didn't pay me this week. When I brought it up to him, he just smiled and saying that he was going to start paying me every 2 weeks. It was kind of annoying, but basically said whatever because I figured I would just have a fat paycheck in another week or so. Well, fast forward another week and I still don't get paid. Now I'm upset. I've been working hard for 2 weeks and not getting paid. I called my boss and asked what the deal was. He claimed he just forgot and was sorry. I shrugged it off and said whatever, it was fine. We agreed to meet on Saturday for the payment. I went to the spot he told me to meet him at, and he handed me an envelope. I took it, and I told him I'd see him on Monday. When I opened the envelope, it was the pay for just 1 week. I called him furious, but he insisted he paid me for the previous week. I flipped it over and told him I didn't want to continue working, especially under the table, and that if he was going to be doing this kind of stuff, I'm completely uncomfortable. He called and begged me to come back for a huge job he had next week, and that he would pay me double. I agreed, thinking this would likely be my last job and I could just cash on and move. Monday comes and I meet him at this huge house surrounded by nothing but open land. We started laying mulch and started setting up the front yard. Before I knew it, I was alone. I didn't see him anywhere. I got a little angry that I was now by myself doing all this work. After an hour or so, I finally see him emerge from the back of the house. He looked frustrated, almost a little nervous. He came up to me in a very soft voice and said, "Can you go and see if you can get the water turned on in the basement?" I tried and I couldn't get it. Please. It's a weird request, but I honestly wanted to get out of the heat for a second, so I accepted. Once in the basement, I found the water hookup in the matter of seconds, but what I noticed right away was that the water was already on. I turned around quickly, and that's when I saw my boss and some skinny woman standing behind me. He had his hands out facing me, and she had one hand behind her back, almost as if she was concealing something. Before I could speak, he said, "You shouldn't have come down here, and just so you know, I am sorry." Thinking quick on my feet, I kicked him in his ankle and ran right by him. I got to the car and drove away and called the police. The worst part about all of it is that there was literally nothing they could do because I was technically working under the table, and there was no records of this man's company, even though I had seen one of his trucks with the logo on it. Fortunately for me, this guy didn't live where I live and didn't know where I lived at all. It almost seemed like the company was a scam from the start, but I'm not sure what his intentions with me were. I know there is a lot I could have done differently, but this is easily the weirdest and most terrifying experience of my life. Was this psycho really going to try to hurt me over a week or so of pay? Either way, I'm glad I've never ran into that landscaping psychopath ever again. Years ago now, back when I was about 8 or 9, my folks and I lived in this huge, weird old house that was right at the edge of this small town in rural Pennsylvania. The local school districts also happened to be in the middle of this big restructuring. So even though I and my little brother were only a couple of grades apart, I went to an entirely different school and took different buses. This meant I was the last person to leave the house every morning, but also the first person to get home every afternoon, since my school was much closer than his. But this also meant that it was also my job to make sure all the lights were off and all the doors were locked when I left every morning to head off for school. So this one morning, I caught on to the fact that the light was on in the basement and that the door was open. So before I left, I saw to it that the light was off and the door was locked. Then later, when I got home that afternoon, I saw that the light was on again and that the door was open. I remember thinking that I was losing my mind or something, and that I had totally just imagined locking up. I mean, I was just tired most mornings after staying up late playing Overwatch, so it was not out of the question that I could have forgotten to do so. So I went over to turn off the lights and close the door. But when I got to the top of the basement staircase, I looked down to see what looked like a big shadowy figure of a male standing at the bottom. I just wigged out, slammed the door, and pushed a cabinet against it. Then I bolted to hide upstairs in my room. For quite a long time, I did not tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and did not think anyone would believe me. A little explanation. It was about Halloween time. I was young and dumb, and happened to have fostered a firm belief in the paranormal. Then about 6 months after that weird little incident, my mom and dad realized that things had been going missing around our house. They blamed me and my brother at first, but after we insisted we were innocent, we all walked around the place with flashlights trying to figure out how anyone might have gotten inside without breaking in. Turns out the thing I had seen in the basement was an actual dude, and he had been climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, working his way through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Only now just realizing I had been alone in the house with him at least once was one of the worst, most terrifying realizations I had ever had in my entire life. I don't believe in ghosts anymore, but I damn sure am terrified of human beings. Hey Swamp Dweller, I have been listening to your channel for some time now. I got to thinking about how a lot of strange and freaky things have happened to me over my lifetime. I grew up and currently live in a ridiculously small town in upstate New York. When I was a small child, I used to tell my mother about the man that came to play with me and talk to me at night. My dad was the only man around at the time and he worked night times. So, obviously, this freaked my mother out at the time as I was only 3 years old. As time went on, I remember always being afraid of my old bedroom. And then one day, after getting home from school, I called for my mother and I heard her say we are in here. So, I went to her room and no one was there at all. I thought it was strange, but whatever. I went to use the bathroom and I distinctly remember hearing a man's voice say my name. I of course told my mother this, and I continued hearing a man call my name throughout the years. Fast forward about 14 years later, and my sister was born. One night around a campfire sharing freaky stories, she said she always heard a man calling her name in the bathroom. My parents still live in this house, and to this day, my own son now is afraid of my mother's bathroom. I suffer from sleep paralysis, and every time I have paralysis, I see a man standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I cannot help but wonder, is this the same man I have always heard and or played with when I was a young child? My friends and some family members have gotten into ghost hunting around the area. We have some incredibly old graveyards dating back to the 1700s and 1800s. There is one area in the woods full of graves most people do not know is there. We as kids discovered it walking and playing in the woods as kids usually do. We had an older friend who drove at the time. We will call him Jeff for privacy's sake. Jeff would always roughhouse and be crazy with his father's truck in these woods. His friend Alan was terrified of the woods late at night, especially the graveyard. We decided to play a prank on him, and being that we were now teenagers, we decided a perfect place would be the graves. So one night we drove him through the woods by the graves only to find the entire gravesite glowing and lit up. We were incredibly freaked out and continued driving into an open field where Jeff's truck stalled out on us. We were trying to get the truck started, but as we were trying to get it going again, we heard drums beating very close by. The sound of the drums sounded like it came from the graveyard. We finally got Jeff's truck started up and hightailed it out of there. However, when we passed the graveyard again, it was all dark like nothing was ever there. My friends and I decided to do some ghost hunting on a very haunted hill in upstate New York. There have been countless strange deaths that have occurred there. A long time ago, a witch doctor and her brother were hung in one of the trees that is still standing. I was unaware at the time that we were going to that location. I kept hearing what sounded like a rope swinging in the tree, but there was no rope at all. There was no wind or anything. It was just a calm, sunny summer day in upstate New York. Eventually, we happened upon the witch's gravestone. At this point, my friends tell me we are here, and then tell us all about her backstory. Honestly, I felt bad for her, so I decided to reach out and touch her grave. I instantly became incredibly dizzy. I almost threw up and fell to my knees. Upon research, I found out that I am not the only person who has had that happen to them upon touching the gravestone. We continue to ghost hunt, and we've gone there many times after this. There are miles and miles of forest there. One night we had decided to come back for a ghost hunt and do more of the trails that were in a different area, but still very haunted woods apparently. We had noticed that our cell phone batteries were draining rather rapidly. We thought this was odd. As we were driving, we became lost and unsure what trail we were on at this point. We stopped the car to figure out exactly where we were. As I stated above, a lot of people were losing their life in strange ways in this area. We have heard heavy footsteps approaching our car, but when we looked up and around, there was never anyone there. We had this gut feeling that was just terrible. We knew it was bad. My friend Jackie, for privacy's sake, looked out her window and started screaming. She said there was a man just looking in at her. We did not see him, but we did believe her. We then told her to gas it, as we did not care where we ended up. We just wanted to get away. As she hit the gas, my mother and I looked out the back window and saw what looked like to be a butcher following our car. I told my friend in the front seat who owns land there. She said there used to be a serial killer back in the day that lived in the area. One night, my friends and I decided to do even more ghost hunting, as I really appreciate a good ghost story. I thought I heard something walking toward me in the darkness, and I saw a branch move like someone was moving it out of the way. Everyone in the group was standing near each other, so we were like, feeling safe, you know? We decided to snap a picture with our digital camera, which by the way constantly dies in those woods for some reason. We caught a silhouette of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned style dress, with a child in her arms and another child clinging to her side. Not too spooky, but pretty cool. We all went to another gravesite, looking for more ghosts, of course. I happened to be standing there with my mom and friends who I always go ghost hunting with. I trust them and they trust me. We always have each other's backs. We had been standing there, and I thought I heard someone talking to me, so I stood still to listen. As I was standing there, it was like I was asleep while being awake at the same time, like I was in some sort of trance. Like this very weird state. It was very strange for me. My friend decided to snap a picture thinking I was just standing still looking for a ghost. The next thing I know, my friends are all running and heading for their car, and I'm just standing there still unaware that in the picture my friend snapped, there was a man standing at my shoulder, talking in my ear. Just typing this story gives me the chills. My mom ended up running back for me and dragging me out of my trance-like state.
I had no clue the entire time that they had been yelling at me, as I had never heard them. I often dream of deceased loved ones and friends and stuff like that. Sometimes I even see my friend's husband who has passed. He has told me to warn my friend that something evil was watching her and wanted her. He said his son was buying a truck and to tell him to watch out for his mother as well. He said he had been trying to keep her safe, but this evil thing was stronger than he was. He told me it required a lot of energy to talk to me and did not have much time to talk. I reached out to my friend and she said, in fact, in the past 2 days her son was apparently going to buy a truck. She had also said she was having a lot of awful things happen to her, including a wolf showing up and being aggressive towards her. My friend has since moved farther away from that haunted hill. One day, I swear, I saw her husband as I was on a walk. He was just standing there with his arms crossed and a big smile on his face. He gave me a wave and a nod. Anyways, these are just a few ghost stories from my small town I have for you. I do have plenty more strange things that have happened to me, but I'll share that for another time. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I do not exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along and told us we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there and I had overseen reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips. We drove back a few days later after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was awfully long. For long stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional small suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers knocked out almost immediately, so most of the trip was just me and my dad talking or listening to music. I am also a very avid reader, so I had my book on my lap besides the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while, because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad only let me turn the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service and the Game Boy batteries had all died. All I had left to do was look outside. Suddenly, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I realized there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, a bowler hat or maybe a top hat style, and dancing and jumping from roof to roof of this suburban lot, kind of like that scene from Singing in the Rain, which at that point I had never seen. It took a second to realize that it was not a normal thing to see. The houses were situated in such a way where they were way too far away for people to jump roof to roof. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field, he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I could not see it, I could sense it smiling. All I felt was dread in my stomach. I turned to face my dad to see if he saw it, but he had been paying attention to the road like he should have been. When I turned back, I could not see the houses anymore. They were too far behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember feeling very afraid that it would follow us, that it could if it wanted to. I never saw something like that in our many trips ever again. Sometimes, I wondered if I imagined it. It just felt so real. The memory is so vivid as well, which always keeps me coming back to this. I am watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way he moved. My name is Bree. I am a 21-year-old female and I live in a small town in northern Ontario. The stories I'm going to share all took place in a house my family and I lived in until I was 13 years old. None of these stories are in chronological order, due to how young I was when they took place. The first story I will share was with my younger sister Mac, who was 2 years younger than me, and at the time I was about 6 years old. We were playing outside one summer day. The wind was blowing particularly hard, and our mother was watching us from inside the house. To give a visual of the layout of our home and yard, our house was known as the backward house, since it was built backward. So, our mother was able to watch us while doing dishes in the kitchen. There was also a massive hedge separating our house from the neighbor next to us, and there was a considerable distance between the hedge and our home. My sister and I were not playing any games, just running around and having fun as kids do. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I and my sister froze like statues. We both looked at each other and simultaneously looked at the space between our home and the hedge. To our surprise, there was a woman there. She was wearing a beautiful long green flowing dress and had equally beautiful, long, wavy red hair and was very fair. She seemed to float rather than walk and seemed fixed on where she was going. As quickly as we noticed her, she vanished into the basement wall of our home. My sister and I then took a look at each other, and honestly, we both looked incredibly puzzled. I did not want to say anything to her at first, because my sister was known to copy me, and I did not want her to say she saw something just because I had. After a few seconds of silence, my sister with tears in her eyes said, "Did you see that?" All I could muster out was, "Uh-huh." We then ran to our mom sobbing that some old lady had just floated into our home. My mom, not wanting to scare us, said, "Maybe it's your guardian angel, stopping by to make sure you're okay." That seemed to ease our nerves a bit, and we were soon back to playing around like nothing had ever happened. As I got older, the experiences in that home seemed to become more sinister. My bedroom had been moved into the basement, and I remember regularly seeing a dark shadow crouch in the corner of my bedroom at night. I had nightmares every other night and had a constant feeling of being watched all throughout the house. My mother would later admit to me, once we moved out, that she was even afraid to walk around the house at night and fears something being around the corner. Another story I remember vividly involves my brother, who is 7 years younger than me. My brother Gio at the time was about 2 years old. We were sleeping together. It was extremely late at night, and for some reason, I just could not fall asleep. To this day, I do not know if he woke up or said this in his sleep, but out of nowhere he says, Bree, do you see it?" "See what?" I reply. "The eyes," he whispered. "What eyes?" I asked, to which he points behind the door. Obviously, at this point I'm crapping my pants. I tried getting him to repeat what he said, but there was no reply. I quickly picked him up and brought him into the living room with me, where we both slept on the couch. I have many other stories about this house, but I will end it on this one. I remember somehow I built up the courage to play downstairs by myself with my littlest pet shops. I was in my toy room that was attached to the laundry room and my dad's workshop. I had set up all my things in a little circle to make a town, and I was sitting in the middle of it. At the point this had happened, I was sitting facing the houses that were up against the wall. The light in the room I was playing in was placed above and behind me, so if someone walks in the room, a shadow would be cast on the wall I was facing. So as I was playing, I had an overwhelming urge to look up. When I did, I witnessed a shadow move from the right of me to the left of me, heading out the door into the rec room. My first thought was, well, maybe my dad was in his workshop and I didn't know. So I look up and out the door and there is no one there. I look back down at my toys and realize my dad is a bigger guy, and I would have heard him walking, and I would have seen him in the time I saw the shadow looking out the door. I book it up the stairs and get the hell out of that basement. As I said, I have tons of more stories that I will submit in the future. Thank you for sharing my story, Swamp Dweller, and if anybody in the comments has had any similar experiences, definitely let me know. This story takes place the summer of 2001 in a small town outside of Rhode Island, where I am from. I am a female, for reference, and I was about 20 years old that summer, in between my junior and senior years of college at the University of Rhode Island. I decided to stay on campus and take some classes so my senior year would be a little lighter and be a bit less stressful for me. So I rented out a cute little apartment with a few friends, and we loved it. Like I said, we were in a small town outside of the city. There were a lot of other college students around, and I enjoyed living so close to the beach in the summertime. My schedule was pretty open, so even though I was working and going to school part-time, I had a lot of time to myself and loved the freedom I had to do whatever I wanted. I have always been into fitness and exercise, and one of my favorite things to do that summer was take my rollerblades to the local bike path and listen to music on my earbuds while I glided down the long straight path. Every day, I would drive to the bike path and park my car at the park close by the path and rollerblade the mile-long path until it ended. Another park would begin actually right after this one ended. At that second park, I would sometimes rest on one of the benches and take a little break and drink some water before turning back and going back down that same path again and ending up at the original park where my car was. It's about a 2-mile go, and I did this about every day. It was fun and great exercise, right up until this incident I'm about to chronicle for you. On this particular morning, I slept in and was running a little bit late, getting ready for my daily workout. I could not find my earbuds anywhere. They were not where I normally left them on my kitchen counter, and after spending some time looking for them around the apartment without any luck, I just said screw it and decided to exercise without them. I get to the park and put my rollerblades on and start my first mile. It was a beautiful July morning, and I was enjoying myself when suddenly, unexplainably about halfway through the mile, something felt very wrong. There was just this gut feeling that something was off. The temperature was in the 80s, but I had goosebumps all up and down my arms and legs. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I had an intense, sinking feeling of dread. I've always had a very strong intuition. I trust it with my life. I felt this feeling before in the past, and it has always served as a warning. But I kept on skating, becoming very aware of my surroundings as I did so. Fight or flight was kicking in, and I didn't even understand why. That was until I saw him. There was a man up ahead on the trail, off the side of the path. The first thing I realized was that he was taking steps backward off the path. He was trying to hide from me in a tree, but I could still see his face from a good distance away watching me, like a dead-eyed predator. He stood there with his hands in his front pockets, not moving at all. As I skated closer to him, the dread in my stomach grew. I noticed he was not wearing workout clothes. He had an oversized hoodie, jeans, and work boots, nothing you would wear if you were expecting to exercise. Now, I had to quickly make a choice. Do I stop and turn around and go the way I came from, possibly endangering my life by losing the speed and momentum I had gained? Or do I keep skating past him and hope he doesn't rush me from the side, pushing me off the path? The fear I felt turned quickly to rage. Quick backstory on me. I am no stranger to violence and assault from men in my past. I thought, why should I live my life afraid? Why should I cater to these men who think they can just take what they want from me? Do they think I'm just going to keep taking it? I felt my hands ball up into fist, my jaw jut out in defiance, and I decided I was standing my ground. Something told me that as I passed him that I needed to remember everything about what he looked like. I noted his dark eyes and beard. I noted his plain blue baseball cap, his hoodie, his jeans and construction boots. I could tell you my nostrils were flared and my eyes were flashing anger, and I glared at him with an intensity that said, I see you there, and I'm ready to fight you if need be. We maintained eye contact for what felt like a long time, but could not have been more than just a few seconds. Then he actually broke eye contact, looked away from me, and I knew he had changed his mind at this point about whatever he was considering doing to me, but I was still not safe yet. I flew as fast as I could to the second park and got off the bike path. Now, I was in a tough position. My car was a mile away, as was my shoes and cell phone. I could not go back down that path again and risk passing him a second time. He might have moved, he might have been hiding in a better place waiting for me, knowing I would need to go down that path to get to my car again. So I took off my rollerblades and made my way over to the road that ran parallel to the path and walked the mile back to my car in my socks, carrying my skates. It probably looked a bit strange to the drivers that went by, and the walk seemed to take forever. Once I saw my car, I ran to it as fast as I could and locked myself in. I never went back there to rollerblade ever again. Unfortunately, the story doesn't just end there though. After this incident, I went on with the rest of my day. I went to class, I made lunch at my apartment, I got ready for work, and went to my closing shift where I work as a waitress. I returned to my apartment complex at around 10 p.m. to find my neighbor yelling excitedly on his cell phone in the parking lot, pacing and smoking a cigarette as he talked. He and his girlfriend lived upstairs from me. I didn't know them well, but they were friendly enough. She studied nursing and he was a business major. We had all hung out shortly after move-in day, drinking beers and smoking joints on their balcony, and I thought they were both pretty nice people. I parked my car and started walking towards the building just as he was hanging up from his cell phone. I nodded politely towards him and he offered a friendly greeting, something like, "Hey, how's it going?" Seeing his face closer now under the lights, I could tell he had been crying. He told me his girlfriend was in the hospital. She had been attacked and violated by a strange man, and was recovering from some various injuries, most seriously, a head injury from smacking her head on the concrete. As he described to me what happened, I felt tears rising in my own eyes and it felt like I had been punched in the stomach. What I said to him next made his jaw drop. I said, "Did that happen on the bike path?" He incredulously said yes, and demanded to know how I knew that. I told him I knew who did it, and I explained what happened to me that morning. He immediately asked if I could talk to the police and give a description of the man. Because of the little voice in my head that told me I needed to remember everything about his appearance, I was able to give a full detailed description of this man to the police. For months after this incident, I checked the news to see if he was ever caught, but I never heard that he was. The girl he attacked did make a full recovery, and shortly after returning from the hospital, she and her parents showed up in a moving van and packed up all her things in her apartment. I never saw her again. For a long time after that, I felt a lot of guilt about what happened to her. I felt that somehow her fate was meant for me, but I skirted it and left it for someone else to suffer through. What did I do to ward off this attack? What did I do that she didn't? The last and most chilling piece of this story, though? The earbuds that I lost the morning of this incident. The ones I looked all over my apartment for and that I had decided to forego using that day because I didn't have the time to look. I found them the next day on the kitchen counter, exactly where they were supposed to be. I know for a fact they weren't there when I looked, and I cannot explain why they disappeared that morning. I know my roommate didn't take them. I can only suppose that my awareness of the situation was the thing that saved me in the end, and some higher power was looking out for me that day.